All right. Well, I don't want to delay this anymore, but as people are filtering in, we'll just get started with some introductions. So this is a town hall on the planning code and zoning map changes for phase 1 that the city is making as part of the general plan update. My name is Allison Moore. I'm a planner at Dyden Bhatia. Dyden Bhatia is part of the technical consultant team helping the city. I'm here with my colleagues Rajiv and Alyssa, if you want to give a wave. And then I'll hand it over to our project manager, Lakshmi Rajagopalan with the city to introduce staff as well.
Thank you, Allison. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for taking the time to attend this town hall on phase 1 planning code and zoning map changes. My name is Lakshmi Rajagopalan, and I am the project manager for phase 1 of the Oakland general plan update. With me today are Laura Kaminsky. Laura, do you want to introduce yourself and pass it on to Kalila?
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Laura Kaminsky, the strategic planning manager, and Kalila.
Hi, good evening. Kalila Haynes in the strategic planning department.
Wonderful. Thank you, staff. So we have a 2-part presentation tonight. The first part will be more of a general overview. We'll go over what zoning is, what it looks like in Oakland, why the city generally is making these changes. And then in the second part, we will go over the 3 main categories of what these zoning changes are. Our missing middle housing type changes, our 2 new overlays, which are the affordable housing overlay and the housing sites inventory overlay, and then changes to industrial land zoning. What we are hoping to do is provide context and background and walk you through each of the different categories at a level of detail that will hopefully give you the gist of the what and the why. However, if you are interested in reading the specifics of the zoning code changes, the full package of exactly how the planning code will be amended, as well as an interactive map, is available on the city's website. So in addition to that education and background, we also want to hear from you all this evening if you have thoughts or concerns, and we hope to be able to answer any questions that you may have. And this input is going to help us really refine any of these planning code changes. So as I mentioned, we're going to be using the Q&A feature this evening. You can use that to ask whatever questions you have as I am giving the presentation. You can ask those questions throughout, and staff will respond in a timely fashion. If we can't answer something, we will get back to you. We will release all of the questions and answers posed this evening as part of the meeting summary of this as well. So if you have the same question as someone else, if you want to click the Q&A, you can see how to interact with it. As people ask questions and you have the same one, you can upvote by clicking the thumbs up symbol. We can answer some of the most upvoted questions live. And then if you have any comments to the Q&A, you can add that as well. We'll dedicate about 10 minutes of each 20-minute Q&A section to taking live questions from you. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you. And then if we run out of time, we can come back to whatever questions that you have and share that at the end. And then there's also a general plan comment email, generalplan@oaklandca.gov, where you can submit comments at any time, at any stage of the general plan update. So just to give you an overview of what has happened and what comes next for these zoning changes, it has been an ongoing process that largely started with the housing element development, where one of the appendices, Appendix J, outlined the changes that would implement some of the housing element actions. I'll talk more about that in just a bit. Since then, the city has held 2 focus groups with community members and organizations on the affordable housing overlay and the missing middle housing type amendments. And then there have also been 2 zoning update committee meetings in March and April. We'll be taking all of this input and refining the amendments for release in the summer. And then they'll be presented to decision makers for consideration in summer or early fall. But before we get into a little bit of background on zoning, we want you to tell us where you are coming from. What neighborhood do you live in? So these numbers here correspond with areas on the map. If you want to tell us where you're coming from, if I think we got an email from someone in the UK, so somewhere else is an option as well. But welcome and so glad to have you all here. I'll just give it 15 more seconds. Okay, great. Looks like a lot of people are joining us from North Oakland and the North Oakland Hills. Some from Adams Point, Lake Merritt, Fruitvale, and then some from somewhere else. All right, great. Well, let's get into it. So, first off, what are we talking about here? What is zoning? So most cities have a zoning or planning code, which are sets of rules that regulate what can and can't be done on a piece of property. This includes the type of use, the shape and size of a building, the height, the density, which is the number of housing units that are allowed on a site, and other requirements. Zoning is used to implement the vision set out in more general land use and development policies and documents like the general plan. The housing element is a part of the general plan, for example. There are a lot of zones in Oakland, but they can generally be divided into residential, commercial, industrial, and special zones where there may be more of a mix of what types of development are allowed. And each zone has different standards on what can be built, what densities, etc. And it's important to note that many commercial zones in Oakland allow housing as a use. I'll show a map of all of the zones that allow housing in Oakland in just a minute. And then we're also going to be talking about overlay zones today. Those are zones that can be combined with these, what's known as base zones, that add additional regulations to address unique characteristics or needs of special areas. This is a generalized map of the zoning categories in Oakland. We can see that much of Oakland is residential, which is the yellow. Commercial areas are primarily focused along major corridors and downtown. Those are the areas in the red. And then purple in West Oakland and along the estuary, that is industrial zoning. And parks and open space are in green. Any of these other colors, like this aqua here, this pink, represent special areas. Some are specific plan areas where there may be that mix of uses again. And this map that I'm showing here is where residential is allowed in Oakland. It's a wide swath of the city. But within these categories are different allowable densities and types of homes that really vary by geography here. So generally speaking, the residential hillside, that is our RH zones in green here, those are primarily, they primarily allow single family homes. And then residential detached are these yellow colors. Those are also single family homes. And then our RM, our light purple, which you can see over here, and then some interspersed over here. Those are single family homes and duplexes primarily. So we can see that there are different parts of the city where there are pockets of single family housing. And so why does this matter? Why do we care about this pattern? So zoning can be used for a number of benefits, including protecting health and safety, preserving natural resources, creating more livable communities, but it has also been used as a tool of discrimination and exclusion that has contributed to patterns of racial and socioeconomic segregation in Oakland that remain to this day. A legacy of single-family zoning was intended to keep out lower income residents and people of color out of these white higher income neighborhoods, and coupled with patterns of city investment and disinvestment that has influenced which of these single-family neighborhoods have more opportunity. So digging a bit more into the history, Oakland's first zoning code was adopted in 1938. The Hills and Upper Rockridge were zoned as single-family residential. West Oakland and the waterfront were zoned as industrial areas with more dense residential interspersed throughout that industrial, which in turn has led to environmental justice issues where these neighborhoods are overburdened by pollution exposure. These zoning changes largely mirrored the redlining patterns that happened in the city where people of color were systematically denied home loans. And if you're interested in learning more about zoning and its history in Oakland, we encourage you to check out the housing elements accompanying racial equity impact assessment. And while the legacy of institutional racism cannot be undone overnight, Oakland's housing element and these rezoning efforts are one way that the city is attempting to create more inclusive communities moving forward. So the housing element, the Oakland sixth cycle housing element was adopted on January 31st of this year, and one of its key goals is to affirmatively further fair housing through a number of policies and actions. And then to implement many of these housing element actions, the Phase 1 Planning Code and zoning amendments aim to encourage more diverse housing types, incentivize affordable housing, reduce constraints on development, and also protect areas and populations that are already experiencing disproportionate pollution burdens. So as I mentioned, I'm about to go over these three categories in a relatively high level, but again, the specifics are available on the city's website, and specifically Appendix J offers a really good summary of all these changes. So first, I'm going to be talking about missing middle housing types and upzoning and height changes there. These changes grouped together are intended to encourage a diversity of housing, particularly missing middle housing types. Those are your smaller scale multi-unit homes that range from duplexes to smaller apartment buildings. And the intent is to get more of those, more choices in currently single-family dominated neighborhoods. But these missing middle types are also compatible in scale with the existing neighborhoods, but also provide more housing at different price points. Thus, several of these zoning changes make it easier to build these types. I'm just going over a few specifics here. So as you saw before on the map, the detached unit residential or RD zones, those were those light yellow zones, are some of the lowest density neighborhoods in Oakland outside of the hillside zones. They generally allow one single family detached unit per parcel. And the city is proposing to combine the RD1 and RD2 categories within that zone and allow up to 4 dwelling units on lots that are 4,000 square feet or larger. For lots that are smaller than that, 2 units are allowed by right, and up to 3 units are allowed if the lot is 3,000 square feet. There are also various changes to the mixed housing type or RM residential zones. Those changes simplify and increase the density steps in each of the zones that allow additional housing units as lot sizes increase. And this table shows a breakdown of existing density in each of these zones compared to what is being proposed. I'll give you a minute to look at this. And we're happy to talk specifics when we get into the Q&A. So there are several other changes that apply to the residential zones. Appendix J has a really nice table that shows all of that information, but a few of these changes include the following. The minimum lot size has decreased from 4,000 square feet to 2,000 square feet in residential detached and residential mixed zones. That's the RD and RM zones. Developments have reduced setbacks now so that more of a property can be used for housing development. There are no more conditionally permitted densities, and I'm going to be using the phrase conditional use permit or CUP a few times this evening. What that is a permit that allows a property owner to develop with a use not currently allowed under zoning if it meets certain requirements. So what this is saying is that if you're removing conditionally permitted densities, all of the densities that are allowed in a zone are allowed by right, and you don't need a conditional use permit for that. There are reduced or eliminated parking minimums for residential zones. They are eliminated if they are within a half mile from a major transit stop, and reduced to 0.5 spaces per unit beyond that. Developers have more flexibility now for where open space in a building can go so that they can build in the most feasible way with the most amount of units. And then there are also increased height limits and allowable density in both residential and commercial zones. So in addition to these changes, there are several areas of the city that will be upzoned or redesignated with a zone that allows for more housing. You can see that those are mostly occurring in the RM zones, those orangey colors, though there is some upzoning in some of the commercial zones in red. And then some allowed densities in each of Oakland zones are also determined by maximum building heights as well. So in tandem with those zoning changes, additional height changes will increase density in some of those areas too, primarily occurring along corridors that are residential mixed use or have commercial zoning there. So now we're going to open up the Q&A for this first section on our missing middle housing types changes, or any questions that you may have about upzoning and missing middle. So if you want to ask some questions in the Q&A, please go ahead and do that. Or if you'd like to ask your question live, you are welcome to raise your hand and I can allow you to speak.
Alison, are we responding in writing only, or will we be responding verbally?
And I see Stuart has his hand up. I'm going to allow Stuart to ask his question. Go ahead, Stuart.
Hi, I live in the Rockridge section of North Oakland, and one of the things we've been looking at trying to figure out ways to put in more affordable housing in Oakland, in North Oakland and Rockridge specifically. And one of the problems we've run into is the very high land cost in our area, which is upwards of $10 million per acre, which is really high. And it's hard to do affordable housing when you have, it's hard to do any sort of housing when you have that high a land cost. And one of the things I'm concerned about is if you're upzoning the area and increasing the height limits, you're not going to still get affordable housing because it's too expensive. People who are going to be building affordable housing will build in areas that have lower land costs. And if you just upzone and don't put any affordability requirements on it, all you're going to get is market rate. And if you're trying to reduce the problems that were created by redlining, that's not going to do it. So I'm curious about how you're proposing to deal with the high land costs in North Oakland.
Well, I think, one, when you're looking at the land, I mean, obviously, if there's a limited amount of land, so if you're able to put more units on a piece of property, that's going to help, I think, maximize the use of that land. So that's, I think, one of the things, we're trying to look at is, is limited land in Oakland. So we want to be able to, especially in areas near transit, be able to put more units on those parcels that are available. In addition, we are looking at, we have affordable housing overlay zone, which is throughout the whole city, which would allow, 2 stories of additional height within of whatever is allowed by right in an existing zone. And then within those 2 additional heights, 2 additional stories, you can do unlimited density within those if it's 100% affordable housing project. So we're hoping that will make it easier for affordable housing developer to build more units in the same area as previously was allowed. And then we also are looking at where we have our housing sites inventory from the housing element. We have an overlay zone for those as well that would encourage a percentage of affordable units within the projects by, if they, at least for the 4th and 5th cycle ones that are being reused, if they provide 20% affordable units, then it'll also be by right development, which we're hoping will also encourage developers to be building a percentage of affordable. Otherwise, we also still have, in addition, our impact fees that are being charged on projects that are 100% market rate projects. And then those monies are used and to help leverage and subsidize 100% affordable housing projects in the city. And in addition, as you all know, we have just recently got the bond approved in Oakland for a large amount of subsidy for affordable housing. And there's also right now currently meetings that our housing department is putting on that is getting input from the community of ways to try to maximize and best use those funds to build affordable housing. And part of that conversation is where those funds can be going, right? Are we going to target certain areas of the city to try to have that housing be built? So there's a number of things that are, as well as looking at, are there existing housing units that are maybe not deed restricted affordable that could then be purchased to be, acquisition and rehab to be turned into 100% affordable. So you don't always even necessarily have to build new housing. You could take housing that already exists in neighborhoods and then try to, purchase that and then change it into becoming permanently affordable housing.
And Stuart, I'd like to add, Laura went through quite a few programs, but we have even more programs if you were to look at the housing element. The housing element, out of the 5 goals that we have 2 specific goals that relate to affordability, and there are a whole slew of programs in there. They have the ones Laura mentioned, but there are also some other ones, including preservation and, and things of that nature, demolition and so on. So I encourage you to look at the housing element itself that was adopted, and I put the link for that in the chat here.
Thank you. So we also got a question from Carla about just asking for clarification about what upzoning is. So upzoning is a term that's used to describe changes to the zoning code that are made to increase the amount of development usually that is allowed on a parcel. So we're going back to our map here. Some of these zones are being increased to the next level, and that generally means that more development, whether that be more density, increased intensity of commercial uses, is allowed. And city staff, feel free to add more if needed.
And then there are some height changes as well, which is the next map that there is. These are strategic height changes. These are primarily in areas that have good access to transit. So you will find them along several of the BART stations. And there are some corridors as well that are targeted for modest height increases. I want to remind everyone that this is a result of implementing the housing element from phase one. The city is undertaking a comprehensive general plan update, and we will be looking at the land use element as part of the phase two, which will begin later on this year. There may be additional zoning changes, height changes, land use changes that may emerge from that process, but these are largely to implement the housing element changes and make some other modest adjustments to ensure that there is, to have a good buffer between some industrial and residential uses. For example, along the east that you can see just down south of the Coliseum, there are some changes out there just to have a better interface between industrial and residential uses.
Thanks, Rajiv. I'm going to call on Jeff next, who has his hand up. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. Jeff Levin with East Bay Housing Organizations. Couple of related questions. For the missing middle zoning changes, and this is sort of building on Stuart's question, we know that that will allow development of more units. We would like to think that that is going to make them more affordable. Theoretically, what we're doing is reducing the per unit land cost by allowing more units, but the pricing is really set in the market. And I don't think we can be assured that simply increasing the number of units that can be built on some of these lots is going to result in significantly more affordable housing. I mean, honestly, we don't have a whole lot of hope that this is going to reach lower income, but it might help for moderate. But I am wondering whether the city is considering at all that for at least some of this upzoning, that it would require at least some inclusionary units at moderate income. So if, for example, a lot that currently could accommodate 1 unit would now accommodate 4, couldn't the city require that at least one of those units actually be restricted at moderate income? The city often talks about using bonuses and incentives to encourage affordable housing, but here you're providing essentially a set of incentives without any corresponding affordability requirement and just hoping that the market will work out. And I'd really like you all to think about whether in the absence of any affordability requirement, you're really going to get units that are significantly more affordable, even for folks in that 80 to 120% of median range. The second question, which is about some of those general upzoning areas you showed on the maps. I'm just curious whether any of that results in parcels that can actually be built at densities of 30 units to the acre and thus could have been claimed in the housing element inventory as sites suitable for lower income, or whether these upzonings here are going to produce sort of a moderate increase in density, but not enough to get you to that 30 unit per acre.
I can respond to Jeff's question about the sites that might allow 30 units per dwelling units per acre as part of because of the rezoning. So Jeff, as you probably might be aware, the sites inventory required the city to look at sites that are currently available under our existing zoning regulations, and that would permit 30 dwelling units per acre. And if we did not have enough capacity to meet the RENA allocations, then we were required to upzone or rezone provide a rezoning plan. But the city not only met the capacity, but also had a buffer. But in addition to this and to further fair housing, we are proposing these zoning code amendments, including the missing middle code amendments.
I'm not sure that completely answers the question. For the upzoning, how much of this results in parcels that are now going to be at 30 units to the acre? I understand you don't have a shortfall in the housing element, although, sort of looking forward, we have to do another housing element in 8 years, and we'll again have to identify suitable sites in the inventory. So would this upzoning result in additional sites that could have been or could be identified as suitable for lower income in a housing element? I'm not asking that you necessarily amend the site inventory, but does this actually result in more parcels that can be built out? Or is this really just getting us at stuff that might be in the 5, 10, 15 unit to the acre range?
Allison, you may want to respond to this question. I believe that this upzoning is already reflected in the numbers that we have included in the housing element.
Yep, so I can speak to that. There any housing element sites that were identified before any rezoning, that net change was reflected in the housing element, but of course there may be other parcels not identified in the housing element that could result in additional units beyond the original zoning. I think the answer is that full analysis has not yet been completed, but it could be something that we look into. And I think that kind of also aligns with Aaron Eckhouse's question too, about how much new housing we might expect this to produce.
And just to, Jeff, respond to your first question, which is about the inclusionary housing requirement. The housing element does call for the city to review inclusionary housing requirements as one of the programs. And that's one of the early action programs as part of the housing element. I believe you're required to, by mid-2024, study that and report on that. So, that is something that could be looked into. I mean, we're just trying to nibble around, as best as we can around the edges of how best to promote housing that's affordable at all income levels, and clearly your point is well taken, but there will be a specific study that will be forthcoming.
Yeah, I would add to that, I mean, if you're talking about on a parcel that has 4 units where there's already 1 unit and you're only adding 3 additional units to require that 1 of 3 of those units be affordable, that's a pretty high percentage of requirement that may deter someone from not doing it at all. And the idea is, part of this is we're looking at opportunities for condo developments because we don't have a lot of condos for sale in Oakland, and your option is basically to buy a single family home in Oakland if you want to have home ownership. Is really one of the few options in Oakland. And so by, these areas where you could have a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex, those could be made into condos for sale that might actually be at a rate, it's obviously certainly more affordable than somebody buying a single family home. So we're trying to look at, multiple options of things that are not happening right now in Oakland.
Are there any other questions that people would like to ask live? Or any questions that
Hi, Allison. There's a few hands raised. There's Julia, Caroline, and
oh,
Stephanie.
I see now. I'm so sorry. Julia, why don't you go ahead?
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, now I think you can go ahead.
Are you speaking to me? I'm Tanya. I'm not Julia. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Your name reads as Julia Greenkrug. If you have a question, go ahead and ask it.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question. I was hearing you say that you thought that 1 out of 4 units for inclusionary is too high of a percentage. That would be 25%. I'm wondering what is the percentage that you're aiming at for the inclusionary housing? I understand that that's going to be under review, but what percentage do you think would be appropriate? Because I think 25% is appropriate, but what do you think?
But it would not be 25% because most of these parcels already have 1 unit on them. So you'd be building 3 new units. So essentially that would be 1/3 of those units would be,
I guess if you're considering, I'm thinking about all units. So if you went from 1 to 4, 1 would be 25%. But so either way, what I want to know what percentage you think is appropriate.
well, again, that we will be studying, that's one of the things we're in the housing element that has asked us to be studying an inclusionary analysis, but 33% is, I'd say, pretty high.
I think
And
it's appropriate, but I don't think that 25 or 30% would be inappropriate. But I'm interested to find out what the city is aiming for. But thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Stephanie, you can go ahead.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
I am multitasking a gajillion things. I kind of joined last minute. I actually raised my hand because I just heard someone say that there aren't enough condos to buy in Oakland. And I found that really confusing because ever since the pandemic, condo inventory has seriously lagged. And I work as a real estate agent here, ear to the ground, everything. And unfortunately, a lot of our clients have had to sell condos they purchased in 2017 at a loss if they've sold since COVID. So the condo market is, funky, and there's plenty of opportunities to buy condos. So that's one issue, is it's not so black and white. Sometimes there are plenty of condos and sometimes there aren't. I do want to see more density. I do want to see more transit-oriented density, and I'm a YIMBY. I'm a Rockridge resident and a YIMBY. And that's why I'm interested in the work that you guys are doing. And I've read over the housing element. But the other thing I wanted to speak on regarding condos being available is that the city itself, we really need to work with the city itself. Because the city is really screwed up, and I've not met a developer who's developed in Oakland who ever wants to come back and develop in Oakland again. And I sent this via email to the contact who was listed on the webinar. Let's see, it was, I used examples of projects at 58 Vernon. So 58 Vernon is a 9 or 10 unit infill project across from the flagship Whole Foods. It's an amazing project, and people still can't move in. And that thing got finished in like 2017-ish. So between OFD and East Bay Mud and PG&E and like whatever excuse they have, that project's literally been finished and buyers can't move in. It's just sitting there, and the developer lost his shirt and he never wants to work in Oakland again. 6105 San Pablo has a funky name. I'm going to get it wrong. I want to say it's like the Gryffindor, the Ryden Cliff at 6105 San Pablo in North Oakland. Another classic example. Those units were finished for years. Their delays were similar, except less extensive than 58 Vernon. But that developer is like, never again. I'm never going to work in Oakland again. There has to be a way that the city could take responsibility to help developers along, whether housing is market rate. What?
I hear you. Yeah.
Whether the housing is market rate or affordable, the city has to get involved, and they have to make sure that they're on top of OFD and East Bay Mud and PG&E and all these delays, because we're not going to get housing built with the way that things are right now. And then if I have another second, I would just like to say, as an owner in the flatlands of an 8,000 square foot lot, I'm really stuck too. I personally would like to add housing as a regular homeowner. I was going to build an ADU until the Oakland City Council stripped all rights away from landlords. And now I'm too scared to have somebody in my backyard who's going to be violent with me or mentally ill or whatever. And the courts are backed up for 6 months and I can't get them out, or,
Yeah, we hear you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we have about one more minute. Well, I think we should move on to the next section. So if you have your hand up, if you want to go ahead and ask your question in the Q&A, we can hopefully get back to it later. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next section, which is about our overlay zones, our affordable housing overlay, and our sites inventory overlay. And thanks everyone for the great questions. Just a lot to get through tonight. So the affordable housing overlay, this is intended to create more affordable housing that is restricted for lower income households through changes to development standards. The city's affordable housing overlay is an alternative pathway to the state mandated density bonus, and developers can choose between the two. The affordable housing overlay only applies to projects that are 100% affordable to lower income and moderate incomes, with some exceptions. We had heard from affordable developers that it can be economically infeasible to build on smaller lots. So to address that, if the parcel is less than 15,000 square feet, the benefits of this overlay can apply if 20% of units on that smaller parcel are affordable to lower moderate incomes. Another perk is that projects can receive by right approval, meaning that it doesn't require approval from a decision-making body. This can help shorten timelines and cut costs. These projects are also exempt from environmental review, and they're also eligible for up to 3 incentives to make it easier to build. And then just going over what those, what is permitted with the affordable housing overlay. These projects are allowed to have unlimited density within the building envelope. That envelope is based on height and lot coverage requirements. 2 additional stories allowed beyond the permitted height in the base zone, and then no minimum parking requirements. The affordable housing overlay does not apply in areas within the very high fire hazard severity zone, though there are a few areas where the city is studying feasibility of allowing the affordable housing overlay there. The AHO is not applied to any designated historic landmark status parcels. And then the height addition, that 2 stories, would not apply in areas with established historical significance if the site contains a contributing structure that may or may not be a designated landmark. So you can see here that the affordable housing overlay covers pretty much all residential and commercial zones, a majority of the city. The areas of study in the very high fire hazard severity zone that I mentioned are within this kind of purple buffer area, and those are still being evaluated. All areas that do not now have at least 2 evacuation routes, that's known as the S9 overlay zone, would be excluded. And then our next overlay is the housing sites overlay, intended to facilitate housing opportunities on sites that the city has identified in its housing sites inventory. That's a requirement of the housing element. That inventory estimates how many units could be built realistically. I say realistically as opposed to theoretically. On sites across the city. The way that we calculated that takes into account market trends and what has developed in different areas of the city. This overlay applies to all sites that are included in the housing inventory. All projects must be a majority residential use, and they must build a minimum percentage of that realistic capacity number as it was estimated in the inventory. The site's inventory also allows for by right development, which, like the affordable housing overlay, means it doesn't require decision maker approval if the projects meet certain conditions. This overlay allows by right development for any project with 20% of its units affordable to lower incomes if that site was identified in prior housing elements. Those are called the 4th and 5th cycles. And then for sites that are newly identified, meaning they weren't identified before, these are brand new sites. These can be eligible for by right approval if they meet these criteria listed. And I have a little example here on this slide. So let's say for by right approval, a project was originally anticipated as a site that would develop with 100 units. 10 of those units were estimated to be affordable to lower incomes. So at minimum, a project would have to develop with 75 units, and that's bare minimum. And then to receive by right approval, if a developer wanted to build less than that 75%, it would have to meet at minimum the 10 units of the lower income estimate, and the rest of the units would have to be affordable to moderate incomes. For the other unit breakdown, it would need to develop that 100 units with the percentage of those units restricted to each of the following income criteria there. The sites where the housing sites overlay applies are shown here. And as I mentioned, they're listed in the housing element. They're also included on the city's interactive map viewer. So now we are in our second Q&A period. Are there any questions on the affordable housing overlay or the housing sites inventory, the housing sites overlay that you'd like us to answer? I see some raised hands. Raisa, do you want to go ahead? I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Raisa.
Yeah, I think the zoning changes are important, and I'm concerned because we've seen what's happened in the past as far as affordable housing. And now we have these different levels of affordable housing. And how are we going to make sure we're going to get the lower categories of affordable housing addressed? The person's earlier comment about what percentage do we think is reasonable? I mean, we just see it's profits over people, and what is going to be put into place to make sure that those who are most impacted at the lower levels can get housing. I'm just not seeing how we're going to make that happen.
I can say that the affordable housing overlay is one way that the city is aiming to incentivize affordable housing development. And there are these other incentives for projects to develop with affordable housing, including this streamlined approval, including by right development. It's in those ways that the city is hoping to do that, but I'll let Lakshmi add on.
I think the question also was asking about the design standards, right? The city is working on adopting objective design standards, which is also a state requirement that the city use objective criteria to assess projects. So we are working on it, staff are working on it at this point, and we hope to have it done by fall 2023, I think.
Great, thanks, Lakshmi. James, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead, James.
Yes. What's the real difference between the affordable housing overlay and housing sites overlay? Why can't they be combined so that there's just one set of overlay rules that could apply to anybody? What's
Well,
the real
there are different aspects. So one, some of this is driven by state law. So the state actually requires us that if we as a city use housing sites from that we used in the past two housing elements, if we reuse them again, then we have to, by state law, allow, if a developer provides at least 20% affordable housing on that site, we have to allow for this by right approval process. So that's different than where the affordable housing overlay, where we're talking about 100% affordable housing. So there's two different things that we're looking at essentially. And also that applies, the 100% affordable housing is applying everywhere, and it's allowing for much higher densities than what we're allowing on the housing sites. And again, if it's 100% affordable, that can still apply on these housing sites. So anything that's 100% affordable, whether it's on a housing site that's in the housing element or on a site that's not in the housing element, can take advantage of that program.
Great. Carolyn, I will allow you to talk.
Yes, thank you. Where on the city website can I find this report and the maps?
Could someone from the city drop the link?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was dropped at the very beginning. I'm not sure if it's showing up for everyone who joined the meeting later. So
Well, I had to
Kalila,
join a little late,
yeah.
so.
No
Okay,
problem.
we'll just post it again.
So it's in the chat.
The link's in the chat now.
And that's your one-stop shop for all things zoning, the interactive map. Thanks for that. We're going to take Ken next. Go ahead, Ken.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for this. I'm with RCPC and we have been watching one of the sites on the housing sites overlay, the site at 51st and Pleasant Valley or 51st and Broadway, carefully to make sure that when and if, but hopefully when it's developed primarily with housing. And it seems to me that the housing site overlay basically accomplishes this by requiring that site to be developed, since it's, my understanding is it's on the housing site inventory, by requiring that site to be developed primarily with housing based on all the rules that you've described. So I just want to make sure, one, that I'm interpreting this correctly, and two, get a sense of when you think this might actually be in effect.
So
Yeah, you're right. That site is part of the housing sites inventory. I'm not sure about the timing. I mean, that's developer driven partly, but Lakshmi may know more about it than
Well, I'm not
than we
asking
do.
about the timing of development, but the timing that the overlay will actually be the law.
Oh, the overlay will go into effect as soon as the council adopts it, hopefully, early fall of this year. Yeah.
Okay. And I just want to confirm I'm correct that that would require any development on that site to be primarily housing based on the rules that you presented.
Correct. And I would also can tell you that the housing element has been adopted.
Right.
So in a certain sense, the planning policies are already in effect.
Great.
The zoning will just implement those policies and provide a clearer pathway. So I mean, that designation is in effect right now.
Great. This is great news. Thank you very much.
yeah, and I'll add in addition that when we adopt an ordinance with the zoning and these code changes, the city can decide at what point these codes apply to projects. So, generally, if a project has not gotten vested rights, which means it's already under construction, we can actually still even apply these, requirements to projects that, maybe have been deemed complete but have not gotten approved, or, so we're, even if a project maybe is submitted like tomorrow, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't still have to apply to or have to adhere to these requirements essentially.
Thanks. We're going to take Jake next. Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Thanks so much for hosting this. It's a really great conversation to be having, and I'm glad to hear there's another tool for affordable housing developers to increase the supply of affordable housing locally. I guess just a question. I'm trying to understand in what circumstances the affordable housing overlay would be utilized in place of state density bonus law and SB 35. I was wondering if you could speak to any type of exclusions for sites, because there's quite a few qualifications that sites must meet under SB 35 to be utilized, and how that differs from what the city's proposing now. And then also the density element, it seems to be less density available to developers than would be otherwise available under state law. And I just curious about what situations you're anticipating people to utilize that program. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so I think what we're proposing for our affordable housing overlay, we're actually trying to, I think, make it easier and more advantageous for affordable housing developers to take advantage of it. We know we haven't gotten actually a lot of SB 35 projects because I think of some of the requirements make it more difficult. Um, and basically this is an alternative to that. It's also an alternative to the state density bonus. So they would not be applied on top of each other. So, you know, a developer could do the state density bonus or they could do the affordable housing overlay. And I'm not sure, I was also, sorry, reading some of the questions. I may have missed. Was that, Allison, did I answer all of it or was there?
Yep, I think that's good.
Yeah,
I'm gonna call on Julia again. Go ahead, Julia.
Hi, so this is Tanya, and I want to know 100% affordable high density housing. So that's the project. And I mean, I went to planning school in the 90s, and they were tearing those down in Chicago and New York. And so it seems like that's what we're going to be building. It's 100% low income, high density. That is a horrible idea that will only take every problem we have in Oakland and make it tragically 2,000 times worse.
Thanks for the comment, Tanya. I'm gonna call on Jeff next.
Thanks. I got actually a question about each of these two proposals. On the affordable housing overlay, I'm seeing now this provision that on, I guess, smaller parcels that are 15,000 square feet or less, those projects don't have to be 100% affordable, but would either have to be 20% affordable to lower or 20% affordable to moderate. Is this new? And what's the point of giving a developer a choice between 20% lower and 20% mod? I mean, wouldn't they just choose to do 20% mod? It's far less of a cost to the developer for the same streamlining benefit. So that, let me put that out there as my question on AHO, and then I have a question on the site overlay as well.
Yeah, so I'll say that's actually an error. So it's supposed to be those two combined. So it'd actually be a 40% requirement of affordable.
Is that new? Is that something you've amended, or was that in the original proposal? I don't remember seeing this before.
It's something new for the since the Appendix J. And so this came up, if you may recall, in one of our discussions about the affordable housing overlay zone, was the idea of looking at potentially allowing for some mixed income affordable to be taking advantage of this as well. And so in this instance, I don't know if that's on here right now, but we're only talking about parcels that are smaller than 15,000 square feet, because this is what we heard in the meeting with affordable housing developers, was that essentially 100% affordable housing project needs a lot size of a certain size, and generally they're not going to build on a lot that's smaller than 15,000 square feet. And so we didn't want to compete with projects that were doing 100% affordable, which is why we're restricting this only to smaller parcels where this could apply. And it's similar if you, I don't know if you looked at San Diego, the city of San Diego. The city of San Diego has a similar program where they require 40% affordable. And they've had actually quite a bit of success on smaller lots of developers doing this. And so that's what we're looking at as a way to also encourage some more moderate affordable projects, because as we all know, we really didn't develop any moderate affordable hardly at all in the last RENA cycle. So we're looking at a way that market rate developers could potentially help with that happening.
I would encourage you to think about some of the implementation issues with something that would essentially allow small projects with a small number of affordable units. If you start getting projects with, I don't know, 20 units, of which 20% are affordable, you've got 4 affordable units that now have to be monitored for 55 years. And I think you need to think through from an implementation standpoint, how the city is actually going to be able to monitor for compliance over that long term, unless you also have some sort of a monitoring fee or something. I mean, the city just doesn't have the resources. The reality is the costs of monitoring aren't really per unit, they're per project. So if you have a lot of projects with a small number of units, that's actually way harder to maintain the monitoring on over the long term. And I just encourage you to think about that before moving forward with this too much, because you could end up with a bunch of stuff that over the long run gets lost to the affordable housing inventory because there's no way to monitor that those restrictions are actually being complied with. On the affordable housing, the housing site overlay, and I have raised this before, we do have some concerns about essentially incentivizing projects with relatively small percentages of affordability on sites in the housing site inventory that were identified as being the sites that could accommodate 100% very low and low income. At some point that will actually start to run you into some no net loss issues. If you get really successful at getting people to do 20% affordable on a bunch of sites that your inventory said could accommodate 100% lower income, you're not going to have sufficient remaining inventory in the element to meet the unmet RHNA. And I think that needs to be thought through. And I'd be really curious to know, within the site inventory, my recollection is that a lot of what got identified as sites that could meet the above moderate RHNA were already entitled or were in the entitlement process already, so that the stuff that actually needs to be coming in for streamlined, by right approval is probably more heavily weighted towards the sites that are the opportunity sites for affordable housing. And I just think it would be a mistake to do something that makes it really easy for predominantly market rate projects to get built on sites that the housing element envisions as being 100% affordable.
I think we have in there, in addition, that it's either the percentage, this is only for the 6 cycle sites, because we have to by state law for 4th and 5th. But for the 6th cycle, we also say that you also have to, at a minimum, build whatever was in the RHNA allocation.
Well, you said the minimum number of units, right? So if a site was
Affordable,
identified,
no, affordable.
So a site was identified in the RHNA in the housing element for 50 units of low income, then somebody could not come in under the site overlay and build 50 units, of which 20 units were, 10 units, 20% were low income. They would actually have to build a project that had, I don't know what that works out to, 250 units, of which 20% are low income, and that gets you your 50 units. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. So
the requirement is for
that they build the number of units, or the number of units in a particular income category.
So Jeff, in table C26 of the housing element, each site that's been identified in the housing sites inventory lists the realistic capacity by affordability level. So what we are proposing for sites in the 6th cycle, the new cycle, that the project should not only propose as many units as is listed in the realistic capacity for that parcel, and also follow one of those 4 conditions that I just posted in the chat. So it's both and, it's not either or. It's only for the sites in the 4th and 5th cycle that the state law is taking effect. The state requires, for sites that are included If the city uses sites from the previous 2 cycles, then we are required by state law to allow 20% affordable housing and permit housing by right.
Yeah, and it should be remembered, there is no requirement that a private property owner build affordable housing on their site. So to the extent we get some developments that want to capitalize on this requirement, and we get a bunch of projects with either 20% or even more affordable housing, it'll be a good problem to have. And we certainly have a buffer in the overall housing sites and the inventory, and we can certainly reassess if this is a dramatic success. It'll be a good problem for the city to have. Yeah.
All right, and then if we could get one more question from Brett, and then we'll move on to the next section. Go ahead, Brett.
I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say I'm a member of the Diamond Improvement Association, and early on in this process, we sent a letter to the city to ask for certain pieces of certain policies in the housing element. Now, I think that overall for each of the different policies, we've gotten what we wanted. We asked for zoning changes along the MacArthur corridor in District 4 that go through the Diamond District that allow for higher density housing to be constructed. We are very much in favor of more density in the smaller lots areas, there more residential areas, but we would also ask for more ministerial approvals for some of the changes to allow for higher developments on those areas. We consider ourselves a high resource neighborhood, and we want to make sure that a lot of other Oaklanders can have access to this neighborhood, just as we do. We're in favor of the affordable housing overlay. One thing that really wasn't addressed too much was the changes that we requested for parking. We wanted a complete elimination of the minimum parking requirements in the Diamond District. We didn't quite get that. State law doesn't quite give it to us. We do have 2 bus lines that intersect with 15-minute intervals during rush hour. Can't figure out why it's not considered a major transit stop, but I think that the city should get a little more aggressive on the minimum parking requirements and alleviating them. I don't really have anything else to add right now. I came to this meeting a little bit late, but thank you for having it.
Thanks so much, Brett. It's recorded as well. Just so everyone knows. All right. So with that, we are going to move to our last section. We have a little bit less time for Q&A on it, but it's a shorter section. Our industrial lands zoning changes. So this includes zoning amendments to protect and alleviate the disparate pollution burdens felt by communities that are currently adjacent to industrial lands, particularly in West and East Oakland. The changes are intended to reduce air pollution in these adjacent zones, improve health, and eliminate racial disparities that stem from this exposure, and minimize conflicting siting of sensitive uses. Sensitive uses are things like schools, residential uses, hospitals, daycares, etc. Avoiding siting those in industrial zones. Those components include a reduced intensity. It's like the amount of building that can of certain commercial and industrial activities permitted in the housing and business mix commercial zone, HBX. In addition to new requirements that certain heavier industrial uses within 500 feet of a residential zone must obtain a conditional use permit. Changes also create conditional use permit criteria that promote appropriate site design, including buffer requirements, as well as mitigation strategies for truck attracting businesses so that they don't adversely impact sensitive uses. And then these changes also reduce termination timeframes for conditional use permits and non-conforming uses for truck intensive industrial activities. These proposed changes also further community identified strategies in the West Oakland Community Action Plan. So with that, we have just a little bit more time, 15 minutes or so, for any questions on industrial land zoning changes, or let's hear those first, and then we can return to any other questions about these zoning amendments that you all may have. Angela, go ahead. If you're talking right now, Angela, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay. In HBX1, where we have industries that are truck, very heavy on truck traffic. What happens with when the zoning change is going to affect and the existing industry are increasing truck activity? What does that affect?
You're cutting out a little bit, Angela, for me, but I think the gist of the question is, how does this affect existing businesses in that zone?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, so, I mean, generally existing businesses are grandfathered in. So until that business leaves, they're allowed to continue. There are ways that the city can try to look at incentivizing them to maybe move. Some of that has been happening in West Oakland with CAS and CWS recyclers, where their city's working on moving them into the Oakland Army base. So that's potential, but that's, does obviously take time for that to happen.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at is that I know the businesses are there and they can't be moved, but they in the cases where the businesses are actually increasing truck traffic, is that going to be permitted?
Increasing of, so generally when you have things that are non-conforming, we have restrictions on, like, you can't maybe add to the business to make the business larger and other sorts of things, which would then maybe cause for that business to add more truck trips and so forth. I don't know that I would have to look at whether we could actually, restrict that, that they can't increase any more trucks from where they're having right now. I think generally it's more on they're not really supposed to expand the operation, but I can look into that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura.
And just, taking a look at some of the questions in the Q&A, there is a question about why 500 feet? Was anything greater considered?
There was.
Hi, Allison. I was just about to respond to that question.
Oh, gotcha.
So we had developed this proposal initially with feedback from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. And like from the studies that we were looking at, it shows that emission concentrations generally decrease by more than 50% within 200 meters of a roadway, and 200 meters is about 600 feet. So that's how the 500 feet feedback was, or proposal was included.
Thanks. James, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Yeah, I see that industrial seems to be diminishing, and it can be a source of jobs and income. And most of the things are restrictions, prohibitions, and regulations on industrial land. Is Oakland doing anything to incentivize the use of industrial land? Are we are we trying to make Oakland attractive for places where there's growth potential, like biomedical, culinary supplies, specialties in light industrial and so forth, to try to invite those or encourage those to come to use the industrial land? Are we doing anything to incentivize?
Yeah, let me quickly take a response to that. Industrial land is actually a big focus of our study and analysis. The city actually within the last 9 months or so, we've convened industrial land focus groups. We've brainstormed with them. We've outlined issues pertaining to industrial lands. They're all on the general plan website and about to come out very soon, maybe within a few weeks, is a paper on industrial lands. It's a pretty substantial paper on which our economists, economic and planning systems has been taking a lead role in looking at what the issues are, what the opportunities are with industrial lands, and how we can move forward with that. So it's a big deal issue, and we're hoping to address that, highlighting the issues in phase 1, but then tackling and outlining policies and programs as part of phase 2 of the general plan update. But thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I would add that in the downtown Oakland specific plan, that's something we've also heard about, the biotech, and that actually biotech was not an allowed use in zones in downtown. And so that's actually something that's being changed as part of the zoning for the downtown specific plan to allow for that. And in general, I think a lot of what we're trying to look at, and we've been hearing as well during this zoning or the industrial zoning analysis, is it ways of trying to have more green industrial uses, and especially in these buffer areas that we could create between where the existing residential is and where heavier industrial is, and trying to have industrial that generates more jobs, because we know obviously like some of these warehouse type uses, you don't really generate very many jobs. So these are kind of some of the things that we're looking at.
I put in the chat, an initial memo that was sent to the focus groups that we met with. So it's not the latest and the greatest, but it does summarize as of August of last year where things stood, and be on the lookout for this new report and study that's going to come out very soon. Yeah.
There are a number of beneficial resources quoted in the chat. Is there a way that can the chat be copied and sent to the participants so that we have access to those resources?
Absolutely, James.
Thanks.
Angela, did you have a follow-up question? I see your hand up again. I'm not seeing any.
It may be left over.
Okay.
Allison.
All right. Well, any other questions about anything else we have talked about today, the suite of zoning changes? James, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, I had a question going back to the affordable housing overlay. And my concern is how that works with the state density bonus, and whether the state density bonus actually undermines the affordable housing overlay. For instance, we've been dealing with the zoning incentive program, and I think we've had some examples that kind of knock us off our feet, like if a developer chooses under the state density bonus, chooses to include a small number of affordable units, like 2, they really get to add 100 market rate units. Now, if the state density bonus program allows something like that, what does that do to the affordable housing overlay? Because does that mean that if a developer chooses the state density bonus, they can simply satisfy the affordable housing by including the units allowed by the state density bonus and put in market rate units otherwise? I'm kind of confused on how the state density bonus operates with the affordable housing overlay.
So they're two separate things. So this city of Oakland is proposing an affordable housing overlay that's an alternative to using the state density bonus. So a developer could still choose to use the state density bonus only, but they can't also, it does not also include them to use the affordable housing overlay, or they can use the affordable housing overlay, but then they would not be able to use the state density bonus. So they would choose between one or the other. We feel that, I mean, it'll just be dependent potentially on the developer. But again, we're really, for the most part, what we're talking about is 100% affordable projects, except for we are allowing an exception for some smaller, on lots that are smaller, which would still require a 40% affordable projects in that instance. So we're really talking about projects that are 100% affordable, and we're actually saying, we're allowing 2 stories of extra height, and then basically whatever density can fit within that envelope. So we're not even really looking at, you get to do a certain percentage higher density than what you could do now. It's really just based on how many units can fit within that envelope.
So if the state density bonus, if a developer chooses a state density bonus in a affordable housing overlay area, does he still have to produce 100% of the basic housing units being affordable, and the state density bonus allows additional affordable housing if it can fit within the envelope? Is that the way that would work?
Well, no, so I mean, if they chose the state density bonus, then they would just follow state density bonus law requirements. So often with the state density bonus law, it says if you produce a certain number of affordable units, then you get a certain percentage of extra units within that. And then you also can ask for certain concessions and waivers of extra height, maybe reduce setbacks, reduce open space, other types of things in order to help your project to be able to build the number of units that you want to build in that project. So that's really, it's kind of a different process, where what we propose in the affordable housing overlay is we've actually already tried to reduce setbacks, reduce open space requirements, and then allow for essentially this kind of unlimited number of units within a certain envelope. Oh, you're muted, Allison.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both. I just wanted to pose one more question based on what I'm seeing in the chat about concerns about elimination of CEQA review, but wondering if the city could also maybe speak to standard conditions of approval and what those are. And
yeah, so for projects, we already have a large number standard conditions of approval that applies to projects that are being built. So a lot of those would apply. And if you, with the draft EIR that's out right now, we're actually saying that these types of, that might normally be as a CEQA requirement, would actually go into a standard condition of approval. for any project that is built or through a streamlined process. So we can still capture those requirements for those projects. You know, one of the things that came up, I think, was with the ECAP and trying to make sure that projects meet ECAP requirements. So we're going to have a checklist that would say, you know, you have to meet all the ECAP requirements in order for us to approve you as a by right project. So a lot of those would be sort of built in as part of the approval process.
Fantastic. I hope that gets to some of these questions about SEQA review. We do have just 3 minutes left, and I know that there are still a few open questions right now. As I mentioned before in the presentation, we will take all of these questions and answer any ones that we couldn't this evening and share them along with the resources provided in the chat as part of a town hall summary. But I wanted to just go back to our next steps so you all can know what comes next in the process. So we are going to take all of this wonderful feedback and roll it into any refinements needed for these zoning amendment changes, and then re-release them in the summer. And then there'll be another opportunity to speak on any concerns you may have or support for what the city is doing at hearings that will happen in the summer or the fall. But I will let Lakshmi or Laura close. You all have been a wonderful group, and I hope that this was helpful in learning a bit more about the complex world of zoning. But thank you so much. And Laura or Lakshmi?
No additional comments, but thank you so much for taking the time to provide your feedback and also ask your questions. As Allison mentioned, we'll collate all this feedback and publish our revised amendments in summer and take it through the hearing process. Thank you. Also, I wanted to remind everybody or let everybody know that the public review drafts of the EJ element, the environmental justice element, and the safety elements are also available for public review until June 22, 2023. And we'll also have workshops around those elements as well. So you could provide your comments through the interactive version available online, or you could download the static PDFs. There are also hard copies of these elements available in the main library. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.